but sometimes it's good to have one. Okay, what we are looking at is a report about how Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, Rabbi Judah the Patriarch, how he behaved in a number of, with regard to a number of observances. We talked about Tisha B'Av already. We're now in the middle of this discussion about Purim itself, and we're trying to figure out how to understand that the report that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi planted some trees or plants on Purim, which seems to be against the general idea that we shouldn't do work on Purim. We're going to come back to that. And also that we also have, so he did it, and at the same time, we have a report that Rav, another great sage, saw somebody working their field on Purim, and he cursed them out. And he was violently angry at him for doing that, which seems to indicate that it's wrong to do this. So how is it that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is reported to have engaged in a practice which seems to be a violation of the spirit of Purim? So the way that we keep on, one of the things that we tried to do was say the distinction that we can make is which day of Purim was it? Because we have this built-in anomaly with Purim that you've got different days that Purim can be observed. So what's Purim for one day might not be Purim for somebody else. So that's the way the Talmud starts playing with this question, and it tries to say, well, maybe when Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was reported to be planting on Purim, the people who saw him planting on Purim thought it was Purim, but for him it wasn't Purim, because for him Purim was the other day. If it was the 14th, his Purim was the 15th. If it was the 15th, his Purim was the 14th, something like that. So we had that question, which also doesn't seem comfortable for a lot of people. Some people said, no, the 14th and the 15th have to be observed by everybody. But anyway, that would be one possible way to do it. And then when Rav got angry at the person who was working the field, that was really Purim. That was the day of Purim, the real day of Purim for both of them, and that's why he got angry. We're gonna now. I think we actually started this, but for my own benefit, we're going to continue at 5b2. 5b2. And we're going to start from the middle of the left-hand column. Okay, the Gemara now offers a different reason why it was permissible for Rebbe to plant on Purim. Does everybody have that, I hope? Okay, good. Nodding your heads, good. Okay, so...
Is everybody hearing this cutting out, or it's just me?
No, Noah says she doesn't hear it. Josie's saying she doesn't hear it. Maybe
Okay.
maybe you gotta...
Just me.
Maybe you gotta...
I'm leaving and then I'll come back.
It's
Bye.
fine for me.
Okay, it's good. Okay, so now Beryl's going to try to come back in again. We need somebody to start reading. Who's going to read for us today?
I can read.
Thank you, Josie.
All right. The Gemara question. Oh no, the
No,
Gemara now offers a different reason why it was permissible for Rebbe to plant on Purim. Rabbi, the son of Rava, said, "You can even say that Rebbe planted on his day."
That is the day on which. Go ahead. Sorry, I'm getting carried away. Go ahead.
On his day, that is the day on which he observed Purim, and yet it was permissible for him to do so, because only the prohibitions against eulogy and fasting did the Jews accept upon themselves. The prohibition against work they did not accept upon themselves. Wow. The scriptural proof.
Go ahead.
First, before the Jews accepted Purim, it is written, gladness and feasting and Yom Tov. But later, after Purim had been accepted, it is written, to make them days of feasting and gladness. and the term Yom Tov, which indicates that work is forbidden, is not written in the latter rendition. This proves that the Jews did not accept upon themselves to abstain from work on Purim.
Okay, so
Wow.
here we have the Talmud speculating about the history of the development of the holiday. By looking at the scripture as and closely in terms of the words that are used from one verse to another, they're also talking about the historical development itself. And they say, look, the holiday of Purim was a new thing. Once upon a time, there was no Purim, and then we had this amazing experience of being saved from danger, and people said, let's start celebrating this. Let's start making a new holiday. And of course, that was the revolution of creating a new holiday for the Jewish people. That takes time. When we wonder about how things happen, well, if the rabbi says it, then it happens. Not at all. No, people can say all kinds of things. People can make all kinds of proposals. People can make all kinds of laws even. But the question is, will those proposals be accepted? Will those practices be adopted by people? So the Gemara says here, at the very initial start of the observance of Purim, the proposal was, let's make Purim full holiday and nobody should go to work, and it should be just this amazing celebration, and we'll devote ourselves completely to this joy and feasting, and nothing else will get in the way. We won't do any work. That was the proposal. That was the initial idea. But then, as it filtered into the community, people were willing to accept the idea of another good time. Great, but you're telling me that I can't go to work, or I can't actually do work, like make it into a Shabbos? I have enough. Shabbos is good enough. So Purim was not accepted by the masses to become a day that work should not be engaged in. So this is in general, the idea, as things have gone on in Jewish history, as the Torah has developed, as Jewish law has developed. What this is talking about is at the start, when something first gets thrown out there, does it become accepted or not, and in what way does it become accepted? Yeah, Sylvia.
I have a question about the meaning of the word Yom Tov.
Mm-hmm. The word Yom means a day.
Day.
Tov is good.
Yeah, so why does that have a prescription against work in it?
Because Yom Tov, then, the good day, is a term that applies to Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, and these are the days that the Torah says you're not allowed to work. So that's the catch-all term for the festivals.
The non-workable festivals.
Right. Well, that's the only kind there are. In the Torah, the festivals are those three festivals, and you're not allowed to do work on those festivals, right? So those are the Yamim Tovim. Besides that, you've got Shabbos, which is Shabbos. So that's not a Yom Tov. That's its own category.
And then you have what we call the high holidays.
The high holidays are Yom Tov. They're also holidays like that. They're also explicitly, it says, don't do work on those days.
So that I realize.
Right. So that's the definition of a Yom Tov. Right. It's a festival. It's a holiday that's not Shabbat, but which is so holy that it cannot be. You can't do work on that day.
So good in this sense means you enjoy the goodness of the day without work.
Very good. Well put. And when you think about it, actually, that's in the biblical story at the very beginning of time. Shabbat, the seventh day when God stops working, right, is introduced by God looking around and going, oh, everything is so good, right? I can appreciate how good the world is. I don't have to do a thing. I'm done. So, yes. Right. So good. So now historically we have that as the answer. And frankly, and as we know, that's where we are today. Right. At this point in history, we have not accepted that Purim should be a day that you should refrain from doing any of the labors that are forbidden on Yom Tov. So now, though, the Gemara asks, top of the column, Josie, back to you.
The Gemara asks, but now that we have established that work is permitted on Purim, why did Rav curse that man whom he saw sowing flax?
So now we're back to this contradiction, right? We have people doing work, but then we have somebody who did work and got cursed out for it. What could possibly be the reason? If it's okay,
Then
what's
why?
the story?
The Gemara answers, because it was a case of things that are essentially permitted, yet some treat them as forbidden. Although work is permitted on Purim, in the place where Rav lived, the custom was to abstain from work. Rav, therefore, cursed the man for violating the custom. However, in the place of Rabbi, it was not the practice to abstain from work on Purim. Therefore, Rabbi was permitted to plant on Purim.
So let's understand a little bit of the chronology of the timing here. Rav is a generation after Rebbe.
Oh.
Rav is immediately after Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. So when Rav is getting angry at somebody for working their field on Purim, we already have Rebbe saying it's okay. But let's go back to this historical process. The fact that Rebbe said it was okay, and the fact that many people did not accept the prohibition of work, what the Gemara is acknowledging is, well, this is spotty. You know, just like there are red states and blue states, there are places that people decided, you know what, we like that idea that Purim should be a day of Yom Tov, like Passover or Sukkot. And they did observe Purim in that more elaborate way. So the fact that eventually, you know, down the line, the majority view prevailed, that doesn't mean that at any particular moment earlier, there weren't some spots that had accepted this as being the legitimate way to observe Purim. And that's what happened. Rav was in a place where in that local situation, the consensus had been to adopt a prohibition against work. And this guy said, I know better. I'm not abiding by this local ordinance. And therefore, Rav got angry at this person and cursed them out because they weren't going with the rule of the community, of the local community, even though that community rule was different than the prevailing practice in other places. So here we have this very intriguing issue of pluralism, of multiple practices in different places. Something that has come up in our own period of time as well. You know, one synagogue does this and the other synagogue doesn't do this. Rabbi, how come you're making this decision when somebody else said that it's okay? The answer is we're two different places with two different people trying to do the best they can in analyzing the situation. Let's look at footnote number 18, though.
If a custom has been established in a particular locale to adopt a stringent practice, even though the stringency is not required by law, no one in that locale is allowed to violate the custom.
Keep going.
Note that this applies only where the populace adopted the custom, knowing that it was not required by law. If they adopted the custom out of a mistaken notion that it is mandatory, the custom is not binding.
Okay, so here we have some interesting wrinkles. Right? What Tosfot and this note are trying to do is dehistoricize this. and say, no, this is not a reflection on the ongoing question that was still up in the air about how to observe Purim. This is a general question down to this very day. Let's say that in general, everybody agrees that whatever, that it's permitted to eat milk dishes after meat if you wait 3 hours. But then somebody says, no, but I think that it's a better idea to wait 6 hours. And they persuade the particular town or region or community that they're in to wait 6 hours instead of 3 hours. So according to this idea, even though theoretically this is a stringency that's not necessary, it's okay to do it the other way. But once people have accepted upon themselves this additional stringency, you can't back out. You can't break that stringency. You have to respect that commitment once it has been made. So what's the basis of that requirement? The basis of that requirement is the practice of making commitments, of making promises, of making an oath. This is a kind of a quasi-oath. Just like you're supposed to observe whatever you say you're going to do, so nobody else has to do it. You voluntarily decided, I'm going to, pay $100 in tzedakah today. There's nobody required you to do that. Nobody else is doing it, but you're doing it because you said you are going. You have accepted upon yourself this obligation. Once you accept an obligation upon yourself, then you have to live up to it. You have to abide by your word. So that's the way these customs become mandatory. A custom becomes a required practice when it is understood to have been adopted by the people and taken seriously. So that's where Tosfot then says, but what are the grounds for why they're doing it? Is it a mistaken grounds, or is it voluntarily assumed with their full knowledge of what's involved? So Tosfot says, if they made a mistake, they thought that this was the way everybody has to practice things, and that's why they're doing it, then that's a mistake. They were under a false impression. So their obligation was undertaken out of a mistaken motive. So then the obligation doesn't apply. 1 second, Sylvia. But if they know everything, it's clear to them, this is voluntary, nobody else is doing this, but we want to do this, then if they adopt that as a practice, if they adopt that as a commitment, then it has to be honored. And here, just one more step has to be done here. This is now moving from the individual to the community, to the collective. The collective has its own organic identity as a legal body. So once you are part of that community, you have to abide by what the community has decided. Yeah, Sylvia.
Well, does this, based on the text that we were reading before, Rebbe and Rav have different views. Does this concept permit the community to change their views?
So that's a good question. Right? So this is now the next step. These are discussions in the Talmud, and it's not so much that Rav and Rebbe have different views; they're in different places at different times. So Rav could theoretically actually agree with Rebbe. Really, you don't have to be so strict. But in this particular place, in Montclair, they decided to be strict. So you, Joe Schmo, you're in Montclair, you have to abide. If you live in West Orange, go ahead and plant your field. But you don't. You live in Montclair, so you have to respect the community's decision. So it's a different aspect of why Rav would have said what he said, and theoretically he could have actually agreed completely with Rebbe. So I just want to clarify that. But now, what the question that you're asking is, what happens if historically we have not just the establishment of a particular practice, but then people want to get out of that practice? What happens if people, however long after the practice has become standardized, What happens if people want to change it? How do you change the practices? And this is a very, very tough problem.
Yeah.
And the Jewish community has in modern times has really struggled with this in many, many, many areas. And the answers are different in different streams. Certainly in the Orthodox community, there is a strong insistence that usually you can't change anything. Once the community has adopted a practice, that practice becomes holy. And this is already, this goes back to ancient times. We have the whole question of keeping 2 days of Yom Tov, back to Yom Tov, right? So we have 2 seders traditionally on Passover, right? The first night and the second night.
I remember how surprised I was as a Reformed Jew when my Orthodox friends in Florida invited me to a second Seder. I'd never
heard of such a thing. Right. So let's back up a little bit. So in the Torah, there's no such thing as a second Seder. There's only one Seder. So and in Israel, there's no such thing as a second Seder. There's only one Seder. It's only outside of Israel that the practice grew to have 2 Seders, because you have 2 days of Yom Tov. In Israel, you only have 1 day of Yom Tov. In Israel, you have only, where, like when we have Shmini Atzeret and Simchas Torah, right? So Shmini Atzeret is the 8th day following the 7 days of Sukkot, and Simchas Torah is the next day. Why are those 2 days? The Torah only has 1 day. So in Israel, Shmini Atzeret and Simchas Torah are all 1 day. It's a very full day. You've got Yizkor, and you've got dancing and Akafis, and you've got all the prayer for rain. It's a very long day, believe me. But in the diaspora, it's split into 2 days, because the diaspora decided, because of all kinds of calendar issues, that we didn't know which day was the correct day. So if we start Pesach on, let's say, April 1st, maybe that's not really Pesach. Maybe Pesach doesn't start until April 2nd. So therefore, we do the first day of Pesach, and then we observe the second day of Pesach as if it's the first day of Pesach. So that's always what we've been doing. So the Talmud asks 1,500 years ago, why are we doing this? We already know now what the first day of Pesach really is. We have a mathematically calculated calendar that works for hundreds and hundreds of years. Everybody gets their shul calendar. It's printed up there. We know exactly what day is the first day of Passover. So why don't we just have 1 day of a holiday? The Talmud itself, like I say, 1,500 years ago, says this is such an ancient custom, we can't change it. So that concept that once a custom has been adopted by the community, it is sanctified by the community, is a very powerful idea. Now, what Josie reported from her own personal experience is, in modern times, the Reform movement is identified by taking a very different tack. No, these customs are not sacred in and of themselves. Everything has to be examined fresh. Everything has to be rethought and decided. And the Reform movement has, a very strong commitment to personal autonomy and to saying, no, the community's decisions don't affect you in any kind of obligatory way. You are free. This is a modern concept, right? And it's a very powerful concept. And thankfully, in many ways, all of us are able to enjoy that freedom that modernity has given us. It's a real gift. How far you extend it is the question. So the Reform movement decided to extend it all the way. And therefore, the Reform movement said all of the things that Jewish people have done for millennia are now up for grabs. So kosher doesn't make sense anymore. So we don't have to keep kosher. So a second day of a holiday, that doesn't make sense anymore. We don't have to do that anymore. Reform was very, very drastic at one point, and now reform has come back in many ways and saying, you know what, we were a little too hasty, we were a little too extreme. Traditions do have sanctity. Traditions do carry meaning. The fact that we've done something for hundreds or thousands of years, you know what, there's something to be said about that. It means something deep in the human heart. It resonates. So now there's a much more openness to adapting traditional practices. Hebrew was thrown out into the garbage at one point as being, what do we need this for? I mean, so there's this whole swing in modern times, and reform has been the strongest place where you could see this being fought out, to extremes. The Orthodox, part of their identity is hold the line, hold the line, hold the line. Never change, never allow anybody to do anything different. From where we are, we're caught in the middle, right? That's what conservative Judaism is sort of defined as, the people caught in the middle, right? The people who want tradition, but also are open to change. And then how you actually balance those two commitments is hugely difficult, very difficult, very difficult. And again, one of the things that the conservative movement, for instance, tries to make a distinction to help us, sort this stuff out, is there's a difference between a law and a custom. The laws are still obligatory. That's what's called halacha. So the conservative movement says halacha is still binding. 1 second, I got to do this. The halacha is still binding. Customs can be questioned. If you have a minhag, then the minhag can be examined to see if it's worthwhile or not. But real laws, something is in the Torah, then it's in the Torah, and we need to accept it. The reform movement, the Reconstructionist movement, says there's no difference. Everything is really just a custom. Even if we accepted it as a law, it's because we decided to accept it. It's really just the people making a decision. Sylvia, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was just curious where in this set of streams, where and what really happened to what was called German liberalism, pre-war German liberalism.
So German liberalism is basically where classical reform comes from, and when it had some interesting kinds of features to it.
I mean, I grew up with it.
Right. But you grew up with it here. So it was
right. We had 2 days of the holidays. The men wore kippot and they wore talis. But kashrut was not a driving force. I mean, those were the framework of it, and Hebrew was very much part of it.
So you are in a much more traditional variation of how liberalism played out, and that was part of the struggle. Everybody was disagreeing with each other, and everybody was saying, no, we think it should be 10%, tradition and 90% change. And other people said, no, it should be 12.5% tradition and 90 and 80. This is the way we fought. This is the way it all developed in those kinds of different ways. Yeah.
The best part about it was that the liturgy was in major keys for the most part.
So there you were.
Beautiful music.
Right. So that was part of a revolution, right? Mm-hmm. This minor key crying, this all, we're not in the diaspora. We're not suffering anymore. We're free. Let's be celebratory. That was very, it was all done. There's a lot of thinking going on in this. There was a lot of absolutely really serious grappling with trying to be true to the particular situation that people found themselves in.
But that died out, did it not? I don't think that
Well, I
exists
think that
anymore.
really is reflected in the traditional wing of Reform now. Where there are the talit is back, the kippah is back. I've told this story before. When I was a kid, a new Reform shul opened up not too far away from where we lived on the island. And we walked over there one Shabbat to check it out. And when we walked in the door, we were told to take our kippah off.
That was Temple Emmanuel. In New York, if you insisted on
In New
wearing
York,
a
that was
kippah, you had to sit in the last row.
That's
They'll
right.
accept it, but you had to sit in the last row so no one could see it.
In the back of the bus. So, right. So
I remember my uncle, may he rest in peace, who was a very Reformed Jew, was very upset when Hebrews started coming in
Yes,
and
yes.
rituals that he had never grown up with. He felt very uncomfortable.
Right. There's a strong feeling, it's a minority feeling, but there was a strong feeling in the Reform movement. 1 second, Gerald. That this was going backwards.
Yeah.
That all the hard-fought victories for a more open-minded, more modern way of living, like all of a sudden, we're going back to this kitsch, to this schmaltz, to this stuff. It was very distressing to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah, Geraldine.
My grandfather's cousin was Joe LeBlanc in New York. I don't know if anybody knows who that was. But anyway, he died, I guess it must have been in the 40s. It was before I was born. And my grandfather, he was buried from Temple Emmanuel. He knew lots of dignitaries. My grandfather did not. And my grandfather went to the shul for the funeral was at Temple Emmanuel. And he walked into the vestibule with his hat on. And an usher came over to him and asked him to remove his hat. So my grandfather took off his hat in the vestibule, but he looked to see if the usher was watching him. And when he went into the sanctuary, he put his hat back on for the service.
That's funny. But can I just go back to what we just read, which implies to me that there should be respect for every community, all the differing communities and their different ways of observing things.
So we're going to get to that in a minute, okay? That's an important question. I just want to share another story, just anyway,
Okay.
an anecdote, because they're fun. It turned out that synagogue on Long Island, and we never went back again. That synagogue that told us to take our yarmulkes off when we walked in. So we said, okay, this is not for us. We're not ever going to go back there, and we never did. But years and years later, I found out that the rabbi of that synagogue was one of my teachers in rabbinical school, and Rabbi Zlotowitz, Zichrono Livracha. And he actually came to Shomrei when I was installed as rabbi. He was a much older man, and he has since passed away. But he was a person who I respected tremendously, and he came out of that Reform background that was very staunchly against going backwards in time. He was a very learned man. He came from an Orthodox family. His father was a big Orthodox rabbi. His brother was a very big Orthodox rabbi, and yet they had a very close relationship with each other. For instance, the Art Scroll, right? The famous Art Scroll publishing empire. We're actually using their Talmud. The Schottenstein Talmud is from the Art Scroll, enterprise. It's a major Orthodox endeavor. It was run by Rabbi Zlotowitz's brother. So here was the super Orthodox rabbi who was brother with his older brother was Rabbi Zlotowitz that I studied with, who was a scholar, but who was convinced that you can't be traditional anymore. You have to do other things. And he was telling me that kicking and screaming, so to speak, he was becoming a little more traditional than he was in his firebrand, youth. And he said that actually he used to, in that synagogue, they said blowing shofar is stupid. Why should we blow shofar? A shofar, good. So in ancient times, they had a shofar. What do we need a shofar? They blew trumpet. They blew trumpet in shul on Rosh Hashanah, because they say a trumpet today is what a shofar was 3,000 years ago. So he was telling me that this is what they did. He said eventually they decided, well, maybe we do need a little bit of some kind of, ancient connection. But he was telling me his own process of thinking and his own process of struggling with this stuff, that he went all the way out to that. He knew that I was much more traditional and that we disagreed about many, many, many important things. But he was a wonderful human being, and he was a very, he was a rabbi that I was proud to have as my teacher, and as somebody who made me a rabbi. So that's something I wanted to say. Yeah, Sylvia. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to ask a very direct question of you. As I recall, and I may be somewhat wrong, you yourself have come from a different background than you're living in today. Is that not correct?
So the background, I have a complicated background. My father came out of the Orthodox world, but was not Orthodox. And I rebelled. Instead of doing drugs, I did Orthodox. So when I rebelled against my father when I was a teenager, I became an Orthodox Jew, so to speak. I was a yeshiva bocher. My father believed that I should get an Orthodox education because he thought that was the best education. And unfortunately, I drank the Kool-Aid. And I was, a very good student, and I was a very devoted student to what I was hearing and studying. And we had, our own little tensions, not little tensions, big tensions too, for years. And until I finally sort of developed in my own way to be where I am today, which is very traditional and yet not Orthodox. And we thankfully, lovingly were able to be together. I'm going to show you a picture that I have here. If I can, yeah, there it is. So if you can see this picture,
yeah,
this is my father presenting me to get smicha. So this is him standing there, and this is me, right? So this is me back in the day. So he lived to see me become a rabbi after I ran away from it, and so on. So yes, I have a complicated background where I have very, very deep roots in Orthodox thinking and practice and study.
and your smicha is Orthodox?
No, my smicha is from the Academy for Jewish Religion. I ran
That's
away
what I
from.
thought.
I was supposed to get smicha at Yeshiva University,
That's
and
what I thought.
I ran away from it.
That's exactly what I thought. Okay.
Right.
So this is right. This is right up.
Please.
This is right up. This is right up your alley. This little piece.
This is what I wrestle with every day of my life. So the question in terms of respecting each community, I think, is a deep question for today. I think that there's a moral obligation to respect people that have struggled with these questions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you then not only agree, that you go along with what they say. For instance, so Rabbi Zlotowitz was a proponent of the idea that we should adopt patrilineal descent. He believed that if the traditional definition of who is a Jew is that you're born to a Jewish mother, you're a Jew. Doesn't matter what you believe, it doesn't matter what you practice. If you were born to a Jewish mother, you're born into the Jewish people. But if your father is Jewish and your mother is not, you're not a Jew. And it doesn't matter if you put on tefillin every day, and it doesn't matter, how pious you want to be. You have to go and convert. You're not Jewish. So the Reform movement changed that. And he was one of the proponents of changing this idea. and saying, no, it doesn't make any sense. If your father is Jewish, why shouldn't you be Jewish?
That was his reasoning?
Yeah,
Not the idea that we're losing people left and
well,
right?
that was part of the pressure, that we're losing people, so we have to be more open-minded and so on. And this makes more sense. I mean, there's obviously in any decisions that anybody makes about anything, there are multiple forces that go into what makes you decide one thing or another. But and he said biblically that's the way it was, so we should go back to the Bible. Right, of course, if we should go back to the Bible, then maybe we shouldn't work on Shabbos. So what do you go back to the Bible with, and what don't you go back to the Bible with? So all of these arguments, are complicated. But he was definitely convinced that as long as you have one Jewish parent, you should be considered Jewish if you're raised as a Jew. So that's the other big if.
When was matrilineal Judaism?
Probably that scholars argue about it, but probably around 500 BCE. When Ezra and Nehemiah led the return of the Jews back to Judea after the Babylonian exile, that's when we have the record of them sending away the non-Jewish women.
Mm-hmm.
So, which made no sense if you're working on a patrilineal model, then the non-Jewish women don't matter. The fact that they're the mothers of your children, so what? All your children are Jewish. But the argument at that point seems to have been no, that it's not good enough.
But why?
So that's when the shift happened, and it, in my view, is a very, very profound decision. And what it does is basically it takes away, in a paradoxical manner, but this father thing makes it very clear, it takes away any genetic basis for calling a person a Jew. And that means that Judaism is not a race. It has nothing to do with what your genes are. Because if it had to do with what your genes are, then yeah, of course, if your father is giving you Jewish genes, then you should be Jewish. But that's exactly the decision. The decision is it's not about that. It's about the experience of being born into the people. And you can be born into the people by converting. And that's also important as a non-racial idea. If Judaism is a race, then either you got the genes or you don't got the genes. So the idea that somebody can join the people, that Ruth can join the people of Israel, even though she has no Jewish parents, that's because it's about being absorbed into the people the way that a baby is enveloped by their mother and then emerges from the womb. That's what the mikveh is. The mikveh is a womb that gives birth to the person. That's the way I see it, and for all of the reasons that it's an ancient idea. I think that it has modern meaning that's important. The point is not getting into the merits of that question, but the point is that he and I totally disagreed on that. Right? We totally disagreed. He knew that I disagreed. I wrote papers criticizing his reasoning for him in his class. He did it lovingly. He was a beautiful human being. He was a beautiful Jew. But that meant that the same way that if I walked into his shul, he would tell me to take off my yarmulke. If somebody from his congregation who he said was Jewish came into Shomrei, I would not accept them as Jewish.
Would you take off your yarmulke to go to his service?
Of course.
You did.
What's the difference? The difference is what's custom and what's core. What's a core practice, and what's stuff that I can, I can, right now I can sit there without a yarmulke. It's not going to make or break Judaism. But I loved him. I respected him. But when it came down to making basic decisions, I made that. I make that decision, and it's actually a difficult decision because the Reform movement has created expectations, in their own community that, hey, so who are you to tell me I'm not Jewish? The answer is I'm not telling you you're not Jewish in your community, but in my community you're not Jewish, And that's a very painful conversation to have.
Yeah.
They're not prepared in their community to understand that there are other communities that need to be respected. So it cuts both ways.
We've struggled with that at Shomrei over the years. I'm not sure where we stand now.
Well, it depends on what you're talking about. If we're talking about who is a Jew and who is not a Jew, we have a very traditional decision that's still maintained.
Participating in services.
So participating in services, again, I make distinctions based on what's the essential part of the service that's requires a Jewish person to do it, and what's a non-essential part. So the prayer for our country, if we didn't have that part of the prayer in our service, the sky wouldn't fall. It's a nice prayer that I believe anybody can offer, because it's about being a citizen in a country and being grateful for the fact that we have a country that makes society somewhat functional. So there are things that we allow non-Jews to or even welcome non-Jews to participate in, but they can't do the things that a Jewish person needs to do on behalf of another Jewish person, because they're not Jewish.
Well, when a mixed couple comes to the bar mitzvah of their child, and there's an aliyah for the parents.
So when there's an aliyah for the parents, the Jewish parent gets the aliyah, and the non-Jewish parent stands in support of their Jewish partner, which is pretty much reflective of what they're doing in their life. And I totally respect that, and I give them, a prayer to say on behalf of their child, and so on, because I totally appreciate that the person who's not Jewish is giving a great gift to their partner and to their child by saying, okay, you know what, I'm gonna support you being a Jew, even though I'm not. So it's not I try not to blur the line, and I try to be respectful and appreciative. Geraldine wants to say something. Wait.
I agree with you with the fact that when it's a non-essential part of the service, I'm okay with that person saying that who's not Jewish, because that person is not representing me. I see the leader of the service as representing me and our congregation. So it's important, like you just said, it's important to me that person is Jewish, but the non-essentials, it works all right. And my second question, would you hold up the picture one more time of your father and you? Now I can only see Josie.
Oh. Really?
Yeah.
Here it is. Can you see it now?
Now I can see it.
Now you can see it because I'm talking.
Yes.
So here you are. Okay?
Thank you.
Right.
I was going to say.
Yeah, so what you were saying, just to support that, our services are based on the idea that we are doing things on behalf of each other.
Right.
So there are things that, as a Jewish obligation that I have, you're doing it to help me discharge my obligation as a Jew.
Right.
So that's when you get an aliyah to the Torah. You say, God, you commanded us to read the Torah. You sanctified us with your commandments. This is a Jewish statement that you say on behalf of the entire community. A non-Jew doesn't say that.
Right.
So other things like the prayer for our country, that the person can go up there and say that on behalf of everybody. Yeah, Josie.
Well, my very difficult, waspy Southern sister-in-law raised her two children as Jews, but they had to undergo a mikveh conversion when it came time for a bar and bat mitzvah because they belonged to a conservative synagogue.
Right. So the conservative synagogue said the fact that your father is Jewish is not enough.
No. And when I asked her why she made this choice, because she comes from a very old Kentucky Protestant family, she said, I didn't want my husband to be the only odd man out in his religion. So this way his children are part of the same religion that he is, but they did have to undergo the mikveh.
So
and they both did.
Right. So I appreciate that she was supportive of that.
Yeah.
And that she made that as a loving choice. And not everybody sees it that way, and it's not to be taken for granted. You know, the fact that she did that was a gift on her part. She didn't have to do that. So I really, really honor that. That was a very beautiful thing.
Yeah, it was. It was very noble of her.
Right? All right.
So
you know, once something becomes settled law, back to Sylvia's original question, when can we change it and how do we change it is a gigantic conundrum. Okay. Now we're up to a third explanation.
And how we do it.
Right.
Who can
And
do
how
it.
we do it. Yes.
Okay, a third explanation of why it was permissible for Rebbe to plant on Purim. And if you prefer, say that really it was the practice, even in the place of Rebbe, to abstain from work on Purim. But Rebbe planted a planting for purposes of joy, which is permitted on Purim according to all customs.
Okay, so now we have a different way of solving the problem, which is to acknowledge, you know, everything, but then make a distinction. Right? Yes, yes, yes. Maybe you actually shouldn't do work on Purim, but there's certain things that you're allowed to do work for. So what is that? The answer is for simcha, right? For joy, which is, after all, what is the essence of Purim? Why are we having the celebration of Purim? It's because of joy, right? So we're gonna continue with this in a second. Let's continue. The Gemara proves.
The Gemara proves that Halakha recognizes a distinction between planting for purposes of joy and other forms of planting. As we learned in a Mishnah, if these fasts passed and they were not answered with rain.
These fasts means the fasts that we were talking about when we were studying the other tractate. The public fasts that were voluntarily adopted because people were praying for the end of a drought, right? So let's say we adopted this whole series of fasts, and nevertheless, we were not answered. Our prayers were not answered. Our fasts were not answered. It didn't rain. Then what?
They must engage less in commerce, in construction, and in planting, in betrothals, and in marriages. And Atana taught.
Wait 1 second. So this is now the idea is we have been, you know, what can I say? Dismissed by God. God is angry with us. So how do we behave? We should behave like someone who has been admonished by their parent. We should have our tail between our legs. We should be hanging our head low. We shouldn't live life in the way that we normally live it, as if everything is okay. So we comport ourselves in a more humble and ascetic kind of behavior, and we're not doing as much business. And we're not, going off and developing things, and we're not, doing plantings, and we're not getting married. Okay, it sounds a little bit like coronavirus time, right? Where we've got this serious depletion of normal life. Except here we're adopting this on purpose because we acknowledge that we need to fix ourselves up. Just a side editorial comment, which is really seriously what we need to do in our society today, recognizing all the mess that we're in and the terrible situations that we have tolerated for generations. Anybody that reads any of at least the non-right-wing press has seen that these are discussions that are happening all the time. What about economic inequality? What about racial justice? What about climate considerations? All the things that we have pushed off and said tomorrow, or not even paid any attention to, now it's coming back really with a vengeance. What are we going to learn from this? Okay, that's my editorial comment. Now we keep going. So clearly what we have here is also we're not supposed to build and develop things. We're not supposed to plant all kinds of fields and orchards and gardens. So that's the statement. And now And a Tana taught. Go ahead.
And a Tana taught in a Baraita regarding this Mishnah. Construction refers to construction for purposes of joy. Planting refers to planting for purposes of joy. What is an example of construction for purposes of joy? One who builds a wedding residence for his son. What is an example of planting for purposes of joy? One who plants a royal arbor.
Okay. So here we have examples of planting for joy and building for joy. And the Tana, the teacher, in this Braita, in this additional teaching to the Mishnah, is talking about what people should refrain from. If we need housing for people, should we not build housing for people? Of course. So when it says we're not going to do construction, so what are people supposed to do? They're supposed to be homeless? Of course we should do construction. So if we don't plant in the field, then we won't have food. So we're supposed to starve to death? So then the answer is we're talking about the luxury level of living, right? So getting married, we can put off getting married, right? When we talk about construction and planting, we're talking about joyous things that we should be minimizing while we're still in the middle of this famine. So the examples that they give for the purpose of joy, what is that? So for instance, to build a special wedding residence, not the regular house, but a wedding residence. If you look at note 22.
When a person married off his first son, he would build him a house with a wedding canopy inside, and the wedding would be held there.
Right. So you don't do that kind of wedding canopy stuff. You don't do all the extra, gazebos and so on and so forth. You just do what you need to do.
Sounds familiar.
Sounds familiar.
Well, that's what's happening now. The big weddings, forget it. But
Forget
people
it.
are getting married.
That's right. Exactly. So downsizing, right? So the downsizing is in relation to all of these celebratory things. So that's where it's not allowed. Now what we have is for Purim, the opposite. The category of celebratory planting is allowed. Not only it's because that's something that adds to joy. So that's what Rabbi did. That's what Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi engaged in. Okay? So with that, we have the finished discussion about that report about how Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi behaved on those special days. Now we come back
Excuse me.
Yes.
Confused.
What?
I'm a bit confused. So in Rebbe's world, you could have, betrothals and marriages in wedding residences?
On Purim.
On Purim.
That's the difference. We have two different things here. We have Purim, which is a happy time, and then the text that was cited. What happens when there's a drought and a famine? What should you stop doing? So by using that category of what you should stop doing in a bad time, that becomes the category of what you should do in a good time. Okay. So moving right along, we're doing good here. Go ahead.
The Gemara returns to discuss Hizkiah's view regarding the status of Tiberius.
Okay, so just to review, remember that we were talking about Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi being in the town of Tiberias, and the question was, is Tiberias an ancient city with walls from the time of Joshua or not?
No, right.
Okay, so we're going to clarify that a little bit more.
The text of the teaching mentioned earlier.
And now we're on 5b3.
Hizkiah read the Megillah in Tiberias on both the 14th and the 15th of Adar, because he was uncertain whether it was surrounded by a wall in the days of Joshua, son of Nun, or not.
Right. If it was a city that had a wall from the time of Yoshua ben Nun, then Purim would be on the 15th. If it was a town that had this wall later, then no, it doesn't count. And then it has to observe Purim on the 14th. So Chizkiah, an early sage, wasn't sure.
Yeah.
So he says, if I'm not sure, what should I do? I'm going to cover both bases. So I'll read Megillah on both days. We'll celebrate Purim both on the 14th and on the 15th.
I have a funny question.
Yeah.
I mean, we seem to know that Joshua, that there were walls around Jericho from, well, the song, and I guess the song comes from someplace in the Bible, right?
Yes, in the beginning of the book of Joshua.
Right. Do we know about walls in any other city?
So that's what we have here. We talked about a few other ones. We talked about Luz, I
Specifics.
think, and a couple of other names of cities that had walls from the time of Joshua. And now we have this questionable situation.
Right.
Right?
That's what I'm
And
wondering.
Jerusalem is also one. Right?
Jerusalem
To
was
this-
walled.
Right. To this very day, Jerusalem celebrates Purim on the 15th.
Oh.
Okay. So the Gemara.
The Gemara asks, and was Hiskiah really in doubt over the status of Tiberius? But it is written in the book of Joshua, and the fortress cities are Siddim, Seir, Hamas, Rakas, and Kinneris. And we have it established that Rakas is Tiberius.
So here we have a list of cities from the time of Joshua with walls, fortress cities.
Fortress.
And even though the name Tiberius is not explicitly mentioned, we have identified that the city of Rakat or Rakas is actually Tiberius. So here it is. We have a verse in Joshua that tells us that this is the case. So why should he have any problem?
Since the verse from Joshua refers to this city as a fortress city, evidently it had a wall in the days of Joshua. How could it be Hiskiah was in doubt over this? The Gemara answers, this is the reason why Hiskiah was in doubt, because the wall on one side of Tiberias was actually a wall of water. That is, Tiberias bordered a body of water which served as a protective barrier. Hiskiah was unsure whether or not such a barrier is classified as a wall.
Okay. So that was his question of definition. It's a fortress city, so it protected itself from attack, but the need to protect itself from attack was only from land attack on three sides. The fourth side was the Sea of Galilee, the Kinneret, right? So that they didn't need a wall for, and a wall wasn't going to be any different. They could see whether anybody was launching a ship across the lake. So the three-sided fortress, Hiskiah was wondering, do you need a walled city completely enclosed by walls, or is this also having the Sea of Galilee, this big lake? Does that count? So that was his doubt. His doubt wasn't a historical doubt. His doubt was a legal definitional doubt.
The Gemara, however, asks, if so, that on one side Tiberias was enclosed by water, why was Hiskiah in doubt? It certainly is not considered a wall, for it was taught in a Baraita. The scripture states, which has a wall. This implies a real wall, and not a wall of houses. The next verse states surrounding. This teaches that the wall must completely surround the city, to the exclusion of Tiberias, whose sea serves as its wall on one side. How then could Hiskiah entertain the possibility that Tiberias is considered a walled city?
Okay, so we've now asked the question from the opposite side. The situation with Tiberias, if it's the case that it only had three sides with
That's
walls,
walls.
and the other protection was the water itself. So now we have a different rule. We have a rule that applies to walled cities with regard to the Jubilee year
Oh,
and to returning property on the Jubilee year. So if you have fields and so on, the Jubilee year says that anything that's out there goes back to its original owner on the 50th year, on the Jubilee year, right? However, when it comes to walled cities, the Jubilee year doesn't work. It doesn't apply. In walled cities, you have 1 year to redeem your apartment, because we're talking about houses inside a city, whether it's a freestanding house or it's an apartment in a house. The Torah says you can't get your house back 50 years later. You have to get your house back within a year of your sale of the house. Otherwise, it goes to whoever it is that bought the house. So cities, walled cities, have this much more fluid situation. You forget the water image, but it's a much more up in the air kind of situation where there is no original owner that can come back 50 years later and claim their property. That applies to the land, but it doesn't apply to the cities. So how do we define a city? So that now that's what we have this little record here. This is walled cities. And the Torah is understood to be saying that a walled city is only a walled city if it's completely encircled, saviv, all the way around. And if there's a wall or protection that has to do with water, that doesn't count. If the wall is tall apartment buildings, but it's not a real wall, that doesn't count. So Tiberias should not be considered a walled city, precisely because it has the water there. So how come Chizkiah thought that maybe it still counts as a walled city when we know explicitly that it doesn't? Go ahead.
The Gemara explains Chizkiah's doubt. In regard to the laws of redeeming houses in a walled city, Chizkiah was not in doubt, for in that context, the verse clearly considers Tiberias an unwalled city. In what case was Chizkiah in doubt? In regard to the laws of Megillah reading, he was in doubt as to the following. What is the definition of the term unwalled places? And what is the definition of the term walled places that are written in connection with Megillah reading? It is a distinction between them based on the fact that the former are exposed and the latter are not exposed. And therefore, since Tiberias too is exposed, for it lacks a wall on one side, it is considered unwalled? Or perhaps the distinction between walled and unwalled places is based on the fact that the former are protected and the latter are unprotected. And therefore, since Tiberias too is protected, for the water serves as a protective barrier, it is considered a walled city. Because of this question, Chizkiah was in doubt over the status of Tiberias in regard to reading the Megillah.
Okay, so the Gemara goes to some length here to explain that there's a difference.
Yeah.
There's a difference in what we're defining as a walled city with regard to redeeming your house, your apartment, to get it back from somebody that you sold it to. That's the Torah's law that I mentioned before about the Jubilee year. That requires strict, requirements of a real wall. It has to be a real wall, can't be other things, can't be water, it's got to be all around, and so on. But Purim is not from the Torah. Purim is a different new holiday. So did we follow Torah criteria, or did we follow some other criteria? It's the definition of a walled city that is required for Purim. Is it literally we need walls all around, or is it really just the principle that counts? A protected city versus an unprotected city. Tiberias was a protected city. The Sea of Galilee was pretty good protection for it. But it wasn't completely walled. So which definition do we follow? Let's read note 31.
From this discussion, it is evident that the definition of a wall in regard to the laws of Megillah reading is not derived from the laws of redeeming houses. Therefore, Rav Yehoshua ben Levi, who derived from a verse written in reference to redeeming houses that a walled city is defined as one that was first walled and then settled, must refer exclusively to the laws of redeeming houses and not to Megillah reading. In regard to Megillah reading, the basic assumption prevails, namely that it makes no difference whether the city was first walled or settled, as long as it had a wall in the era of Joshua.
Okay, so this brings us back to an old discussion that we had. We don't have to revisit it completely, but just a little bit. If we're not making a complete equivalence between the Torah's requirements for a walled city with regard to redeeming their houses on the sabbatical versus Megillah, if we're not making a complete equivalence, then we had a discussion earlier that sounded like we were. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, well, in the sense of in the case of a walled city where you can redeem your house within the first year, that requires that the city was first walled and then settled, but not the opposite. And then we applied it. Apparently, we thought we were applying it to Megillah as well. Now what we see from this discussion is no. We have to isolate that statement of that sage and not apply it to Megillah at all. However,
most other commentators maintain that Rav Yehoshua ben Levi does refer to the laws of Megillah reading. Some explain that Rav Yehoshua ben Levi disputes the very premise of our Gemara. In his view, the laws of Megillah reading and redeeming houses are interdependent. Others differentiate between the specific issues discussed here and by Rav Yehoshua ben Levi, and thereby resolve the conflict between the two passages.
okay. So again, we have these two different Talmudic discussions.
Yeah.
What's the relationship between the two of them? Are they in agreement with each other? In which case, we have to figure out why they seem to be saying something different. And that's one way to make the distinction. Okay, so that one is only talking about the topic of redeeming houses during the sabbatical. And the other one is talking about Megillah, two different discussions. Or now we have a different idea. If we actually read these two discussions, one sheds light on the other, and we see that not everybody agrees with this Gemara. We see that actually Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, an early sage, does not agree with this discussion in the Gemara and doesn't say that there's a difference between redeeming houses for sabbatical year and Jubilee year versus Megillah. There's no distinction. And this Gemara is actually the opinion of somebody else. And Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi doesn't agree with it. So this brings us, back again into the open-ended nature of Talmudic discussions. What do we do when one Talmudic discussion in one part of the Talmud doesn't seem to square with the discussion in another part of the Talmud? Do we make them into arguing with each other, or do we find a way to harmonize? So different sages here, different commentaries have chosen one way or the other. Okay, we're going to stop here. And the next time we continue, we'll be able to continue with the end of this page. I will be sending out another PDF with pages 6 and 7, all in one PDF. So that I intend to do that. But I want to make it clear to everybody that we're skipping the next 2 Sundays. We will not be studying together the next 2 Sundays. We will resume the beginning of August, God willing.
Are you on vacation, Rabbi?
I'm taking a few days vacation. I'm going to my summer home in Montclair.
Oh, your other home upstairs.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
With your doggy.
Okay, well, Take care, everybody.
Enjoy a vacation.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.